I'm going to talk today about something that we have long talked about in this class, about how rulers use a variety of methods to gain legitimacy, to consolidate their power, and to be seen by the people that they rule to have the right to rule. All right? We've talked about legitimacy throughout this year, so when we're talking about things that we've talked about throughout the year, we call those what? Continuities. Very good. So this should just kind of go in line with any conversation that you'd ever have on a continuity and change over time question about states or leaders establishing or maintaining legitimacy, the right to rule. Yes, ma'am?
What standard was this again?
431. Y'all are killing me. All right. Here we go. First, leaders would use the arts, in particular monumental architecture, to display their political power to their followers or their subjects and legitimize their rule. And I've got a few examples from around the world that you guys can take a look at, that you would be able to use on examples on an essay that talked about how rulers might use monumental architecture to demonstrate their authority. And why do you think building something like this would show to your followers that, yes, you really are the leader and you are to be respected and followed? Yes, ma'am?
It's like if you build something so great, it'd be like something that you have a lot of power.
Absolutely. You've got power, you've got wealth. Yes? I'm sorry, say it out loud for you.
It would show that you're wealthy and that therefore you kind of can control things.
Okay, you can control things because of your wealth and power. Absolutely. You can do things that normal people just can't do. Yes?
Could it be used as a distraction like Roman Colosseum?
Sure. Maybe we have an example of like a bread and circuses thing again. We heard this the other day, where people can feel pride in their state. People can feel pride in their rulers because of, oh, well, look at, we may be kind of poor ourselves or have a hard time getting by, but look what we have in our society. So let's just run through a few of these examples of states and their monumental architecture. This, of course, is what?
Taj Mahal.
The Taj Mahal, built during what dynasty in India? The Mughal dynasty. The Mughal dynasty. M-U-G-H-A-L. Does anybody know what this building actually is? Yes?
Like a shrine.
Very good. A shrine or a mausoleum for his wife. Very good. For an emperor named Shah Jahan. You don't need to write his name down or worry about it. But he's one of the Mughal emperors. And he built this as a final resting place for his wife. What do you guys notice about this as a piece of architecture? Yes? Okay, there are minarets around it, even though this is not a mosque, but that should remind us of the Mughal connection to Islam and incorporating ideas from their architecture. Yes, ma'am? Very symmetrical. Yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am? Very good. And these like onion-shaped domes as well. Very good, which we see in Persia, and we're going to see again in Russia in a moment here. Speaking of onion domes, this is what's called St. Basils Cathedral in Moscow. St. Basils Cathedral in Moscow. It's a church in Moscow. It is within what is known as the Kremlin in Russia, the seat of government of Moscow in the former Soviet Union. Of Russia, pardon me, in the former Soviet Union, within Red Square. Yeah, very good. And this was built during the reign of Ivan IV. And he would literally bring in architects from the West, Italian architects, to come to Russia to construct him a massive church, the likes of which had not been seen before that far to the north and the east in Europe. So here is an example of the Tsar's authority in Russia. We've already talked about this before, but here you will see again, this is St. Peter's in Rome, St. Peters Basilica in Rome. This is the seat of the Roman Catholic Pope. St. Peter's Basilica. This was mostly constructed during the 1500s. In fact, it was the sale of those indulgences that so frustrated Martin Luther The sale of those indulgences were going towards the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. But obviously, if the Roman Catholic Church now has the most ornate Christian church, because by the 1500s, what has happened to that formerly most ornate and impressive Christian church? It became a mosque once the Ottoman Empire took over Constantinople. So now St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, an example of Roman papal authority. And then we've got a couple palaces of kings. We've got here, this is known as this is the Palace of Versailles. This is the Palace of Versailles in France. We spoke about this the other day, constructed by King Louis the 14th, very good. King Louis the 14th, not only as his home, but also for a home for the nobles of France. And so the nobles of France, remember, these were the landlords that in earlier ages had to stay on their land to oversee their land and protect their land from outside invasion or from other issues that might come up. Well, now in France, under Louis in the 1600s, what do we have? France actually having a professional military paid for by the state. And Louis XIV building this Palace of Versailles and bringing all the nobles to Versailles.
Enter back door.
I can't answer the back door. To bring all the nobles to Versailles so they can party and dance and have a good time, and Louis XIV can keep an eye on them. Here again is that example of strong central authority, and Louis XIV was one of the most absolutists of all absolute monarchs. In fact, Louis XIV proclaimed that I am the state of France. He said, I am the state. Strong central monarch, weak landlords. Well, in this case, the lords, the nobles of France, are partying in tights and high heels in Versailles. And then this is a palace which kind of looks similar architecturally to the Palace of Versailles. Does anybody know what this is? Not in Poland, but good call. It kind of has like a little bit of an Eastern look. No, it is, anybody? No. This is in St. Petersburg, Russia, and this is known as the Winter Palace. St. Petersburg, Russia, built by the Tsar named Peter the Great. And this was his house that he had built. And of course, Peter the Great, we talked about him. He was the guy that looked to the west, right? Peter the Great wanted to look to the west to make Russia more like that because he saw Western Europe as the future. And so it's not surprising that he built a palace for himself that looked just like the palaces that were being constructed by the monarchs of Western Europe. Good? Good. So, we got one more here. Talked about this in Asia. The Forbidden City, very good. Constructed during the Ming Dynasty in Beijing. Now this was obviously, you could see it from the outside, but it was a walled city. This kept the emperors isolated in China from the outside world around them. But obviously, this gets the rank for the largest palace system on the planet. There's no bigger palace network than the Forbidden City in Beijing. So all of these examples show us how rulers are going to use monumental architecture to show their followers, show their subjects that they have a right to rule. And we do the same thing today too, right? President lives in the White House. You walk by the White House. I mean, it doesn't certainly look like the Winter Palace or the Palace of Versailles, but you walk by the White House and you're like, that just looks presidential, right? Just living in there kind of looks like you got something over. Yes?
Have you ever heard of something called the Kowloon Walled City?
No.
It was in China.
Uh-huh.
I don't remember when it was built, but it was, they kind of destroyed it, demolished it during the 60s.
Okay.
But it was just 6,000 square miles.
Wow.
It was very small.
Oh,
It
okay.
was a bunch of basically buildings pushed together. There was over 30,000 people in it, and
Wow.
it was one of the worst things.
I want to Google that and see what that's when we're done here. Okay, let's give a couple other ways that kings would legitimize their rule. In Western Europe, we would have the notion of divine right of kings. Divine rights of kings gives the idea that God has bestowed upon these rulers the right to rule. And Western European rulers like Louis XIV, painted here with an angel above him placing a crown upon his head, Louis XIV became one of these absolute rulers who used the authority from God to rule his populace. Divine right of kings is saying that the king's power cannot be checked on earth. You know, in the United States here we have checks and balances, and the president's power is checked by Congress and the Supreme Court. The king's power is not checked by any earthly being. It can only be checked by God himself. And so if the king derives his power from God and his subjects are practitioners of that same religion, well, you're going to give authority and allegiance to this king, of course, right? For Catholic nations, the king's power has to be endorsed by the Pope. And this is going to go all the way back to the age of Charlemagne. And here is that little painting of King Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800 CE. You don't need to memorize that, but it's something we've looked at already in this class. Obviously, when the Protestant Reformation takes place, we start to see a separation from this absolute rule based on divine rights of kings, or at least people associating with churches outside of the Roman Catholic Church. It wasn't just the Christians that were using notions of religion to solidify their rule. In the Middle East, in what is today Iran and in the surrounding areas, the Safavid Empire, Safavid, S-A-F-A-V-I-D, used Shiite Islam, or Shia Islam, to solidify the rule over their empire. The first Safavid ruler, a guy named Ismail, I-S-M-A-I-L, proclaimed himself to be a descendant of the original Shiite imam or caliph. And do you guys remember back when we talked about the origins of Shia Islam? Who did they believe was the right caliph, the caliph that should have been? Ali. Very good. So Ali is considered within Shiite Islam the first imam. Ismail, all the way down into the 1500s, proclaims himself to be a descendant of the seventh imam in the line following Ali. So giving himself religious authority connection to these earliest leaders of the Shiite Islamic faith. So he will use this religion to solidify his rule. The leader of the state in the Safavid Empire will appoint religious leaders and prayer leaders throughout the state. He will support mosque construction, so giving government funds to build mosques. And do you guys see how this is all run hand in hand? If the emperor is Shiite, running a Shiite state, and he is proclaiming himself to have some divine connection to the faith, he's going to then use government resources to build more mosques to make sure more people in the empire are strictly adhering to his faith and seeing him as a legitimate ruler. Good? Good. Let's hop to another chunk of the planet. In Mesoamerica, Aztec religious leaders, supported by the state, supported by the emperor, would use rituals of human sacrifice as a key religious ceremony, but also it became a government-sponsored public spectacle. Again, think of your bread and circuses here. And these would be attended by thousands upon thousands of Aztec citizens to witness these rituals. And this will help the government establish its authority over the population. We also talked about how this practice within the Aztec Empire worked to terrorize neighboring states. And that the Aztecs would use conflict and war with their neighbors as a means to gain people for these sacrifices. And at times, these sacrifices would, and during certain religious ceremonies, would get massive. The biggest recorded was over 20,000 people massacred or sacrificed in this way. 20,000. Yeah. How do you, it's kind of incredible, isn't it? Kind of incredible.
Like an assembly line.
And now tourists go to Mexico and climb up these things, right? I want to remind you of something that came up in an earlier discussion known as flower wars. Do you guys remember this phrase? The flower wars. Flower wars is the term that was used by the Aztec and their neighbors when they would actually at times prearrange conflicts. Like, we're going to have a staged conflict, essentially, so the Aztec warriors can capture victims for these sacrifices. Now, why would a neighboring state agree to such a thing? Well, it keeps them from taking us over outright, or keeps them from taking more than we're willing to give of ourselves. Another way states would work to solidify their rule and to legitimize their rule was to establish effective bureaucracies. And sometimes, and here we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to stressing the strict adherence to one religion, we would have a state like the Ottomans who are in kind of a unique position in that as the Ottoman Empire is going to expand, they're going to bring in a lot of different kinds of people practicing things beyond Islam. All right? Now, this is a picture of the Ottoman Empire at its greatest extent, stretching to the north of the Black Sea, stretching across North Africa. And you can see, and unfortunately I couldn't find the same map in English, but I will translate for you. You can see that the Ottoman Empire is going to have a lot of different kinds of people within it. They've got, obviously, vast tracts of land where there's primarily Muslim populations. But then they're taking over in the Balkan Peninsula of Europe. They're going to take over regions that are primarily Orthodox Christian. They're going to also, once they get into places like Romania, take over places that are primarily Catholic Christian. They're going to also take over, and you can't really make it out on this map, some areas that have Jewish populations. You see smatterings of Jewish populations throughout the Middle East into Egypt. The Ottomans kind of took a page out of the book from earlier civilizations, like maybe the Romans or Alexander the Great or the Persian Empire. When you rule one of these massive multi-ethnic empires, rather than ruling with an iron fist and forcing everybody to follow your lead, like we might have seen in France under Louis, you must be a Catholic. In the Ottoman Empire, they'd be more willing to let local believers continue to practice their faith. They did this through what was known as the millet system, M-I-L-L-E-T. Millet, from my understanding, and you can correct me if you need to, is from an Arabic word meaning nation. Does that sound right? Derived from an Arabic word meaning nation or state? Does that sound like anything you've connected? What is that? Say it. Say that out loud. Spell it. Really? Okay. Well, I'm seeing stuff made up in my books. M-I-L-L-E-T. You can see there's like maybe a connection route. Anyhow, what you have is the Ottoman Empire dividing itself into these millets, where there will be a Muslim millet, and there will be a Catholic millet, and an Orthodox millet, and a Jewish millet. And within this system, the Jews can run their system the way they see fit. They can still practice Judaism. They can construct synagogues. They can live their lives as they see fit. The Christians can live their lives as they see fit. Why does it not surprise you that the Muslim Ottoman Empire would create and have this kind of system? Yes.
Because of, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't he?
Very good. The earliest beliefs of Islam that say that the people of the book, Christians and Jews, are to be this dhimmi population, to be protected and tolerated. Now, this does not mean that they're going to have equal status necessarily with Ottoman Muslims, but within their local communities, they can run their show as they see fit. Plus, there is also the pragmatic reality of what might happen to the Ottoman Empire if you start forcing the majority of your citizens who aren't Muslim into being Muslim, or you start persecuting them. What will those people do? They'll revolt against you. As early as about 1530, this is after the Ottomans have taken over Constantinople, and they've pushed into southeastern Europe. 80% of the Ottoman Empire's population is not Muslim. So they've got to act a little bit differently. They've got to be more tolerant of their non-Muslim population. Yes, ma'am?
Can you talk about this from Hillary?
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of a city-state almost? Like, because like when you're saying it like in a way like
Sure.
so they can rule by themselves, so it's like a system of
Yes, but they different from it. When we talk about city-states, like Athens didn't owe Sparta anything, or vice versa. All right, when we talk about city-states, it is just a state that is centered on a city. Now, there might have been similar connections between them. They spoke the same language. They went to the Olympics and partied down. But they were independent, isolated states. In the Millet system, they're all still a part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire is all of their ruler. Whether you're Jew or Christian or Muslim or whatever, the Sultan is still number one. But the local leaders that the Catholics appoint, they will answer to the Sultan. The local leader that the Jews or the Armenians or the Orthodox Christians appoint, they will answer to the Sultan. Good? Good. Two last things to mention. In the Ottoman Empire, they would incorporate a system called the Devshirme. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's how I pronounce it. Devshirme. Just because how it's pronounced or spelled. Devshirme. Devshirme. I don't know. You say potato, I say potato. The Devshirme system, where the Ottomans would go particularly into southeastern Europe, the Balkan Peninsula, Christian areas, and they would take the boys. Not all of the boys, but they would snatch up some boys from these Christian communities, usually between like 7 and 10 years old. And they would take them, and they would essentially be slaves, but not in the sense of chattel slavery. Like if you got to be a slave somewhere in world history, this is the way to do it. You'd be taken by the Ottoman Empire, and you'd be taken away from your family, and you would be converted into Christianity, or converted into Islam. You'd be converted into Islam, and you would grow, and you would be trained from a young boy either to serve in the military or to be a civil servant, work for the government as a bureaucrat. But as you would grow, with military or civil service training being your life's work, you would become a pretty incredible soldier or a pretty impressive civil servant. And so the Devshirme boys who would end up serving in the military became part of what was known in the Ottoman Empire as the Janissary Corps. The Janissaries. The Janissaries. These were the elite soldiers of the Ottoman Empire and essentially the bodyguards to the Sultan. And in some cases, those boys that would end up working towards the civil service could rise all the way up to the position of vizier or grand vizier. The grand vizier is number 2. That's Jafar, right? The grand vizier is number 2 in the empire. So these like former Christian boys who were taken away from their families, taken from their families to serve as slaves, would end up being raised up to have some very important positions. Now, why, if you were an emperor or a sultan of the Ottoman Empire, would you run your system like this? Yes?
possibly to show that there's a way to rise through ranks.
There could be a way to rise through ranks. Okay, for some, yeah?
Or they would like, oh, I can be Islamic and then I can be higher
Sure, yeah.
To limit the power of the Christians.
Maybe to limit the power of the Christians, because you are taking some Christians away. Sure, man.
Maybe like legitimize, because now you have these supporters and like.
Okay, the Janissaries, because these might have been like peasant Christian boys who would have had no opportunities outside of their farm or their traditional home. And give me one more minute, guys, I'm so sorry. These would have been peasant traditional boys. And they're being taken away. And they're given opportunities that they would have never had before, right? They're given a better life than they would have ever had before, at least like materially speaking and power speaking. So who do they owe their allegiance to?
The king.
Only one guy. They're absolutely loyal, in the beginning at least, we're going to have problems in the next era. They're absolutely loyal to the Sultan, because he gave them that position. All right? Now, obviously, some families, hang with me for a minute, we're going to be okay. Some families would be like, no, don't take my boy. And there would be some protests and families trying to resist this. But in some cases, families would be like, take him. You're going to give him a better life than I could ever give them. So this did happen. We've got one more example. One more example to mention. In China, the bureaucracy that existed in the earliest days of the Han Dynasty with the examination system is going to continue all the way now into the Ming and then the Qing Dynasty. The examination system as a way to find talented bureaucrats. That's going to exist, and that's how the Chinese state maintains its legitimacy, through these bureaucrats carrying out the orders of the state.